All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. It's so wonderful to see you all today as we kick off this best practices in public speaking conversation. I hope as we take this next hour or so to talk through this topic, I hope you'll do a couple of things for me. Number one, I hope you'll take a second, even right now where you are, to think about what it is that you struggle with the most when it comes to public speaking, when it comes to presenting an idea in front of an audience, in front of a potential client, in front of a classroom. Where do you struggle the most? And maybe today we can take some time to think through those things and figure out ways to start to combat them, start to turn around some of those issues that you may have in your own presentation style. So let's start off today's session with a quick question, a question that I hope you'll take a second to think about in your own mind and see how you would answer it yourself. Here's the question. Why do some presenters present for 2 minutes, but it feels like 2 agonizing hours have gone by in your life? And other presenters present for 2 long hours, but it feels like only 2 minutes have gone by in your life. I'll say that again. Why do some presenters present for 2 minutes and it feels like 2 hours have passed, and others present for 2 hours and it feels like only 2 minutes have passed? If you're comfortable using the chat, you're welcome to throw in some comments into the chat even right now so we can start to think this through together. Why does this happen? Why is it that sometimes I'm sitting in a class and I'm engaged and I'm totally understanding everything that's saying? Or why am I sometimes in a meeting and everything makes perfect sense from the presenter, but other times I just can't follow? Other times I'm completely disengaged. Why does that happen? We're going to take some time this afternoon to address that question, because the truth is all great public speaking, all great professional presentations come from a place where they address that question. How can I make a 2-hour presentation feel like only 2 minutes instead of a 2-minute presentation feeling like 2 hours? I love some of the comments that are coming in. Relevance is important. My interest in the topic, engaging, charismatic. Is there a connection? Is there simplicity and a flow or a narrative in the information? Is there passion? All of that plays a giant part in how much you connect with not only the speaker, but the topic as well. So even as we have this conversation, I want you to think about those great presentations you've watched in your lifetime. What did the presenter do? Was there some characteristic, or was there a trait? Was there something that was happening throughout the presentation that kept you captivated, that kept you engaged, that kept you involved throughout the time you were there together? And as we're speaking today, let's take some time to think through, what is it that I'm currently not doing that I could ultimately do there as well? So let's keep that question in mind. Why do some presenters present for 2 minutes and it feels like 2 hours, and others present for 2 hours and it feels like 2 minutes? I think all great public speaking, it comes from a place where we're constantly working, against the things that we don't do well and trying to adjust and build on the things that we could do better. So I want to ask, what keeps you from being that public speaker, that polished professional presenter that you hope and desire to be? If I could share a little of my own personal journey in this regard, I grew up deathly afraid of a couple of things. And one of those was snakes, and the other one was public speaking. That was it. Everything else I felt like I could deal with except those 2 things. I just didn't have what it takes to actually do this well and to be comfortable in doing it. In fact, here's a little confession to everyone who's a comm student right now. I attended the College of Communication as an undergrad and as a grad student. My 4 years of undergrad, I think I raised my hand once in a classroom, which makes it highly hypocritical that I now grade on class participation. But here's the thing though. It was so uncomfortable for me to speak out loud because I felt so vulnerable and I felt like every eye was on me and I just couldn't do this. And the truth is, for most of us, there's some barrier that prevents us from taking that next step toward the polished professional presenter that we could be. There's some barrier that exists. So let's start addressing that first barrier. Many of you who are on this call right now are probably somewhat comfortable with public speaking. Some of you might feel completely comfortable. And then there are the rest of us, the ones that are highly anxious and get nervous every time I have to present. There's an automatic reaction that happens both physically and mentally as soon as the thought of presenting comes. Someone assigns me something, hey, I need you to present in this classroom, or I need you to present in front of a client. And suddenly the anxiety starts to build and everything gets really hazy. You start to stress about what you have to present, when you're going to present it. You start to stress about the content. You start to stress about your notes, your slides. You start to think about everything else, and it gets stressful. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself, why do I get nervous when I present in public? Where does that anxiety come from? It's a question I asked way later in life, and it took me a long time to come to some of those answers, but it's some answers that are very discoverable, answers that we can all find. The truth is, all of those nerves come from the fight or flight phenomenon that exists in all of us. Now, if you think back to our earliest ancestors, they had to make a decision when they wanted to eat on any given day. That decision was a simple and a quick one. If they walked into a jungle or a forest, they had to decide quickly, can this creature or animal, can I eat it or will it eat me? And that was the quickest decision they had to make. And so when making that decision, their brain would send signals to their body to prepare them for either fight or flight. If the animal was one that they could consume, the brain would tell the body, get ready to fight, be confident, be aggressive, be assertive, get ready to do this. But if the animal was bigger than the person who was in the forest, suddenly the brain would start to send stress hormone throughout the body. The stress hormone that would cause your heart to beat faster. Stress hormone that would cause the liquid to leave your mouth and your throat and start to go to your lower muscles to start to lubricate them to get ready to run. Hands would get sweaty, feet would get sweaty, your body would shake, especially in the leg area, because you knew this was a critical life or death moment and you had to escape. Does this sound familiar to public speaking for some of us? Your heart starts to beat faster. You start sweating in your hands, your mouth and your throat go dry. You can't focus on any one idea and everything is kind of running through your head. Your legs start to shake, your feet get sweaty, and all of it's because of the nerves that are caused by the fight or flight phenomenon. Here's what's happening. Your brain is fooling your body into believing that this is a life and death moment, that speaking in front of 10 or 15 of your classmates is the same thing as facing a tiger in the wilderness or a jungle. That's the same thing. Now think about that for a second. That's ridiculous if we think about it. But our brain and our body work hand in hand when it comes to fight or flight scenarios. And public speaking is one of the most critical fight or flight scenarios that the common modern day human being faces. We go to these moments and we start to think of them as life or death. So very quickly today, before we begin some of the best practices in public speaking, let me help us start to uncover some of the best practices in overcoming nerves when it comes to public speaking. How do we overcome some of our nerves? The first word I want to give you today is perspective. The truth is that if you want to be a stronger version of yourself as a public speaker, it starts by changing the way you look at this moment. The truth is, most of us look at public speaking as a threat to our existence, a threat to our success, and a true way toward failure if I don't do well enough. And so the perspective starts to cloud the way our brain thinks. Remember, your brain is the one sending those stress hormones throughout your body because the brain believes that this is a tiger that I'm facing right now. So how do we change our perspective? I don't want to ask you to raise your hands, but how many of you are procrastinators? One of the biggest connections we know between perspective and success is procrastination. If you are assigned a public speaking task, maybe 3 weeks or a month in advance, the truth is, and I've asked this question to my students for over a decade now, and the answer is very common. It's always the same. I usually start about 3 days before the presentation. I'll practice once or twice a day for 2 to 3 days, and then I'll deliver the presentation. Now, what's happened? For 3 weeks, my brain has been building up this perspective that what's about to happen is life and death, and it's such life and death that I'm going to push it back 3 more weeks before I even get started on it because I don't want to think about the threat to my existence. And the perspective right from the moment you're assigned the task is starting to go negative. It's starting to think of threats. And remember, when something is a threat, your brain tells your body, treat it as a threat. Get ready to run. There's no fight going on. Fight would be confidence and aggression. None of that's taking place in those moments. So one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to start early. We're going to start working on our presentations quickly. As soon as we get them, we're going to start working on them. It doesn't mean you have to complete them. It means you should start even opening up a Word document and writing down the title. writing down the topic. It means opening up a PowerPoint deck and just writing the first slide or creating the title slide. Here's what it starts to do to your brain 3 weeks early. It starts to tell your brain, this isn't a threat because I've already started addressing it. And your brain starts to lower some of the nerves. Those same ACTH hormones that are coursing through your body, those stress hormones, start to lower. And you start to realize that as you get closer and closer to the presentation day, your perspective is different. This is not a threat. It's an opportunity, a chance for me to do really well in class, a chance for me to get a better grade, a chance for me to impress my professor, do well at work. It starts with a perspective change. The second P word that I want to introduce you to is a word that you've probably experienced a million times. It's practice. For many of us, practice is something that we've always done, but we didn't always know how to do it. I'm sure some of you even listening right now are athletes or were athletes, and you knew what practice was in your life. It was this daily repetition in order to get better and better at something, whether it was playing a sport, playing an instrument, or writing, or whatever it might be. Practice was something that you did daily in repetition to get better at something. Now, what about in public speaking? Do you know on average, the typical public speaker or presenter will typically practice 3 to 5 times before they present? And why? Because they believe 3 to 5 times is good enough. Now, where else in life does 3 to 5 times of repeating something get you through a life and death scenario? It doesn't typically work. Yet practice is something that we often ignore. So some of the things I want to encourage you to do even now is to think about how you practice and attack not only the way you practice, the quantity of your practice, but the quality of your practice as well. Here's some tips on practicing. Number 1, practice rigorously. This means practice way more than you already do just to get comfortable with the idea of speaking the content out loud. So that means practicing a lot. If you have 2 weeks to present, or if you have to prepare and present on a topic, start 2 weeks in advance. As soon as you have one idea down, or as soon as you have a big idea, repeat the big idea. Make it a part of your habit to talk about it, talk through it, openly start to say the words, and watch what happens. It starts to become a part of not only your vocabulary, but a part of your brain and the way your brain perceives the speech or the presentation. Practice is critical. It's got to happen a lot of times. So if you practice 5 times now, try to practice 10 times for your next presentation. Watch what happens. You get more and more comfortable with each practice, and eventually your brain starts to settle itself when it comes time for presentation day. If you practice 10 times now, I encourage you to try 20 times. Watch what happens. Over time, you'll notice that you get more and more comfortable, but you also get comfortable with the content, which ultimately lowers the nerves. How should we practice? Here's some quick best practices with practice. Number 1, always practice out loud. One of the biggest mistakes we can make is practicing in our heads, just practicing in our own minds. The truth is, if we do that, the brain starts to give you the words and the belief that you're good enough with the words that you've created in your brain. Now, the problem comes when you add the pressure of an audience and your heart racing faster and fight or flight taking over. The practicing in your head often does not equal the right words coming out at the right time. So we always practice out loud. We say the words out loud so that it becomes a constant loop of learning. Brain formulates the word, mouth dictates the word, brain hears the word, and again, that loop has closed. We're hearing it and learning it over and over again. So we practice out loud. I encourage you to record yourself. Listen to your content over and over again. There are no rules that you have to memorize your speeches or memorize your presentations. In fact, I would encourage you, just know your signposts, know where you're going next. But just in the same way, I'd also encourage you to try to think of your speech, try to think of your practice as this exercise in hearing the words and learning the words. Know them. Not memorize them, but know them. So record yourself. Get into the habit of practicing in front of people so that you can read body language and facial expressions, so you can take in immediate feedback and you can also respond to that feedback as well. So I encourage you to practice in front of people. Get into the habit of practicing several different ways and practicing out loud every single time. And then up the number of practice sessions so that over time it becomes less and less grueling when it comes to the day of the presentation. Let me give you the last P word when it comes to overcoming nerves, and that's the word persona. Persona is the idea that All of us have a cap to how far we'll go. There's a ceiling to how far we'll go when it comes to taking risks as a public speaker. All of us have ceilings. Those ceilings are built over a lifetime of habits. Those ceilings are built because we're not comfortable going beyond a certain level. And so we've created ceilings. Personally, for me, I would never elevate my voice. I would never speak slow, because speaking slow meant there would be silence, and that was not comfortable for me. I would never pause. I would never look my audience in the eye, because I struggled with eye contact. And all of those were ceilings that I had created. Now, how do we overcome those ceilings? You see, your persona is really a part of how you present, but what we believe when it comes to a persona is that if I can take small, calculated risks, small, calculated steps to overcome some of my biggest ceilings, my biggest caps, the barriers that prevent me from presenting better, if I can take small steps, eventually those are not ceilings anymore. Eventually I've surpassed the ceiling. So here's how that works. So next time I present and I know I have trouble using my hands, I'll take this small calculated risk. At one point in the presentation, I'll use my hands once. And what I've done is I've broken down the barrier a little bit for the next time around. Let's say that I struggle with eye contact. I'll make eye contact with one person for 2 seconds and see what happens and break down the barrier a little more. If I have struggles with raising my volume or slowing down, I'll purposefully find one sentence where I can speak it out loud and emphatically, and also slow down as I speak it. As I do these small steps, I start to change the persona I have as a speaker, because I'm directly combating my biggest weaknesses in public speaking. So what are some of your biggest weaknesses? Go ahead and take a second and throw them in the chat if you'd like. What are some of the most common issues you've had when it comes to presenting? For some of us, it might be a lot of verbal fillers, right? We've got those ums and uhs and likes and so's, and we're throwing those into every sentence. For some of us, it's speaking too fast. For others, it's not knowing when to pause. We see a lot with fillers. You know how we address that is every time that we use a filler, what we're actually doing is we're filling in silence, because we believe silence is awkward. And so we're filling it with this awkward word that we've created. Verbal fillers, by the way, are learned behavior. None of us are born saying and We've just decided to do that over time. One of the things that we can do to address that is directly address it. So if you're finding yourself using ums and uhs a lot, first and foremost, you have to be aware of it. You have to dislike the sound of it, and then you'll start to change the behavior. So how do we do that? Starts with your personal conversations. In your own individual conversations with friends, with family members, with roommates, think about starting to understand and be aware of some of the sounds that you're making to fill silence, and becoming comfortable with the silence itself. As you get into presentation time, practice in front of another person. Every time you use a filler word, have them make a loud, obnoxious noise that makes you have to stop presenting and start over again every time you use a verbal filler. Eventually, you'll start to hate the sound of it, but that requires intense, intentional practice as well. Let me look at some of these other comments that you're sending in right now. Some of us struggle with formulating our thoughts. Yes, we'll talk about that in just a second. Second guessing yourself or blanking out, which is very, very common. I can sometimes speak a little too quickly. Yes, if you haven't noticed, I have the same struggle. There's a lot of stuff around thinking clearly while in front of people. Very, very true. Equipment not working. Standing still. That's right. Especially when you're talking about walking around a room, or maybe even the nerves have gotten so big that you can't stand still. So you're constantly moving, and it's apparent to your audience that you're doing it, and you're doing it because you're nervous. Here's where we want to start when it comes to persona. We want to address each of these little things that we're noticing about ourselves by taking a small calculated risk. Starts in practice time. So if you're noticing that you're blanking, your thoughts are not staying with you, maybe first we can address how we're creating our notes and how we're doing our organizational structure of our speeches, which I'll get to in just a moment. And then after that, as we practice, start to practice sections of the presentation. Practice the sections and then practice them in an order together. So you're saying, here's section 1, I know it well. Here's section 2, I know it well. Now get to a place where you're thinking while you're presenting section 1, How do I get to section 2? This is what we call signposting. It's the idea of there's the signpost that I have to get to, a mile marker that I have to get to. So as you're presenting, you're ultimately presenting to get to that next mile marker so that you can present the next idea. And that's something we do to overcome that blanking in our head, to overcome that, uh-oh, I lost my train of thought. I encourage you to try that with your persona, a small calculated risk that you can take. Let me move forward with our topic today, especially because we're talking about something that requires us to take some time in advance. So I ask you, how do you create your presentations? What are the steps you take to create what you're going to talk about? Whether it's a class, whether it's a informative presentation, a persuasive presentation, whatever type of presentation you're doing, you're pitching a client for new business. Any type of presentation has to start somewhere. Now, here's the problem that we typically see. Most presenters start in a place where they just throw all of their ideas out and then start to move their ideas around, and we have a presentation. Other presenters make the mistake of opening up a PowerPoint deck and just starting to fill up a PowerPoint deck full of slides so that we can get this great presentation put together by simply coming up with all of these great slides with all this information, when if we're being honest with ourselves, the slides are really just our notes that we're putting on a screen to make it easier for us to present. Here's what we really want to do whenever we present on any topic. Start with the big idea. I'll repeat that. Start with the big idea. What is the big idea? What's your narrative being built around? We'll work off of that and create all the other parts of the presentation, but we must start with the big idea. If you've ever watched a great TED Talk, this is what every TED Talk has in common. They're built around one idea. It's the same for great presentations, whether it's a company announcing its earnings for a quarter, whether it's a PR plan or an advertising plan being communicated, whether you're pitching for a new film that you've created or a documentary that you'd like to do. Whatever presentation you're doing, you're always thinking about the big idea, and everything else connects to the big idea. And here's why. Audiences, especially adult audiences, they do not care about our 9 or 10 points. They care about our big idea because the big idea is what we will likely remember. There's a concept in adult learning. It's called the inbox mentality. When adults hear something, they hear it and they quickly process it. Do I need this now? If the answer is yes, I will keep listening and I'll remember it. If I don't need this now, I will process it quickly and it'll go right out and I won't think about it again today. So throughout your presentations, this is what you're doing. You're creating a presentation where you're thinking about the adult across from you who's asking the question, do I need this now? Your big idea should be a response to that question. Do I need this now? Yes, here's why. And the big idea should answer that question of, yes, you need this now because it somehow affects or benefits your life. Build your big ideas around your audience's needs. Watch what happens when that takes place. There's suddenly going to be a new exchange where the audience says, yeah, I'll buy in, I'll listen, I'll remember because I need this sooner in my life. So the next time you're putting together a lecture, next time you're putting together a presentation in your classroom, think about that idea of the inbox mentality. How do I organize so that my audience realizes they need this now? So now you've got this big idea. What do you do from here? I encourage you to start to break out your big idea maybe into 2 or 3 subsections that are carefully crafted to support the big idea. So if you're presenting on one large idea about a new product or a new service for your company, use those subpoints to talk maybe about features, and then the next subpoint to talk about what this means for the marketplace. Build out those 2-second sections so now you have a structure, big idea, and you've got your 2 or 3 supporting ideas below it. I think a great presentation will always have something at the beginning that attracts that audience. Remember, your audience is listening to try to figure out what's in it for me right now. So your opening should be something that captures the attention of your audience and then focuses that attention and directs that attention in the way you want it to go. Let's think about this for a second. The best presentations do not start with the words, hello, today I will be presenting about. Because there's really no benefit to either yourself or your audience in revealing that, except in very, very specific situations. In fact, the best presentations we typically see, the ones we remember, are the ones that use the opening to capture attention and then focus that attention. So how do we do that? Maybe you can tell a story right in the beginning. Instead of going right into your quarterly earnings for your company or going right into the lecture for today, tell a story right at the beginning. Watch what happens to your audience. Your audience starts to perk up and listen because we're naturally trained to want to hear how a story ends. And so a story is a great way to open up. Maybe there's an analogy and an anecdote. There's some sort of illustration that you can use right at the beginning. Maybe there's a great question you can ask right at the beginning. If you remember back maybe about 25 minutes ago, there was a question that even right now we used in this lecture. Why do some presenters present for 2 minutes and it feels like 2 hours? It's a question to get you doing the work so that the presenter can get you to come toward him or her. That's part of what we're doing as presenters. We're not just regurgitating information. We want the audience to do some work to come toward us. This is the importance of asking great questions. The third idea I'd give you also, beyond just telling stories and giving great statistics or great questions, is to use a startling statistic, some sort of fact that can really blow the audience away right from the beginning. I remember I once had a student doing a presentation about the problem of hunger and the problem specifically around world hunger in specific parts of the world. And as she was presenting, she was going to start with, today I would like to talk to you about world hunger. But rather than doing that, she used a question and a startling fact. She started with the simple fact of, by the time I finish my speech today, do you know that 1.2 million people will struggle with hunger and over 10,000 will die before I'm done? And that simple statistic, in fact, suddenly blew away the audience, and it got us thinking, wait a second, this is a way bigger problem than I thought it would be. And is there something I can do about it? All of this is part of this concept of figuring out, how do I attract attention, and then how do I focus that attention? So in your openings, try to take a little bit of a calculated risk there, a story, a statistic, possibly a question that you can use to begin. And then when you go from there, connect all of your ideas back to your audience's life. What is your audience going through? What is your listener struggling with? And how can you connect new information to their lived existence? How can you connect those two? Constantly try to find ways to connect the two of them. Now, whether you're speaking to inform an audience, speaking to persuade an audience, constantly be thinking, how can I maintain their interest throughout the presentation? Tell stories, deliver statistics, give examples, share with them all of these startling data points, and ask questions of them to get them to pay attention, to get them to stay with you on the journey that you're asking them to go on. In just a little bit, I'm going to open up for some questions for our session today as well, so that we can address some of the specific things that you may be going through or struggling with. But as we do that, start to think through some of the other behaviors that you have that might not be working when it comes to presenting. You want to always have your big idea. You want to have your supporting messages, and then you want to have your strong stories and strong stories and statistics and data points underneath all of that. And all of it is delivered with that idea of signposts. I'm in my introduction and I'm working to get to point number one. I'm in point number one. I'm going to tell that story to get to point number two. I'm going to be in point number two and give that statistic to ultimately get to point number three and close. You're signposting. You're constantly giving yourself direction on where to go. Here's what happens when you signpost. Suddenly your brain is not so fixated on, oh no, I don't know the words. Oh no, will I go blank? Your brain is just focused on the next signpost. I just need to get there. In fact, throughout our time together today, I've just been signposting. I've been thinking in my head, where do I need to go? I'm not focused on what do I need to say right now, because I know that if I know where I'm going, I'll get there. This is part of what we do through our practice time, and it's part of what we do even with those small calculated risks that we take. So what are some of your other issues? Some of you said that you struggled with eye contact, or you struggled with hands, what to do with them. I struggle sometimes with just keeping my focus on the idea. The best habits that we can create as polished professional presenters is to practice everything that we struggle with. Remember, the only way to overcome those learned behaviors is to learn new behaviors. So we learn them in our practice time. Here's something that I do, especially when it comes to eye contact. I will have someone sitting across from me or a couple of people sitting across from me, and I will practice and I'll focus in on my eye contact as I'm presenting. Here's what I notice in those practice sessions. I struggle to remember my words because I'm so fixated on my eye contact. And then the next time I'll try it again, and I'll try it again, and I'll try it again. By the fourth or fifth time, it's easy because I know the words because I've been repeating them, and I know the eye contact because I've been repeating it. It's the same with our hand gestures. Start simple. Maybe have your elbows close to your body, open up those hands, keep those nice open hand gestures. Use them once or twice in each section. Try it, make it natural. Sometimes it'll seem unnatural and it'll even look like that to your audience at times, but practice it because over time you'll notice that it just happens. It's not something that you have to forcefully and willfully do. So keep that in mind as well. One of the last things I want to touch on before we get to our Q&A session for this afternoon is, what do you present while you're presenting? It's the idea of visual aids. Visual aids are PowerPoint decks. Go ahead and take a second right now and put in the chat, what are some of your biggest pet peeves with PowerPoint? When someone is presenting a visual aid, what are some of your biggest pet peeves? Love to hear them. Yeah, many words on a screen, reading the slides, reading off the slides. I bet about 12 other people just deleted right now because they were also going to write reading off the slides. It's the most common complaint that we hear when it comes to PowerPoint and visual aids. Yet for some reason, 30 years of PowerPoint and we're still doing the most common thing that people hate or dislike when it comes to PowerPoint. We're inundating our slides filled with words, and the truth is we're doing it for one simple reason. We're doing it because it makes us comfortable, and us being the presenter. Let's be honest, those of us who've created PowerPoint decks, how often did we use our decks to be our notes? So I didn't have to hold my notes. My notes could be on the screen right next to me. So I made it easier for myself to use a visual aid. Here's a question that I want you to always ask whenever you open up a visual aid software or tool. The first question you should ask, in this presentation, who will be the presenter and who will be the visual aid? I'll say that again. Who will be the presenter and who will be the visual aid? Because between you, the human, and the screen that's next to you, only one of you can be the presenter and only one of you can be the visual aid. The problem is that many of us as presenters have completely given up our role as the presenter and handed it over to the screen. And the truth is, audiences, especially adult audiences, are making a decision. If you give them an option, hey, audience, listen to my droning or look at the screen, the audience will almost always choose the screen over you. Visual learning is something we do right from our earliest ages. And so if we can see something, we're more likely to try to decipher it ourselves. If you put a chart up on a screen or a graph, or you put a complex idea on a screen, your audience is going to study the screen more than they listen to you. So how do we combat that? How do we do that differently? Part of what we're going to do is start to make decisions with our visual aids that are audience focused, not speaker focused. So how do we do that? We want to create our presentations in such a way that our audience will hear from us and know that the learning and the persuasion and the charisma are all coming from that presenter. Everything I see on the screen is just going to reinforce quickly what this person is saying. I'll learn it on the screen and I'll come right back to the speaker because that's where the real learning is coming from today. That's the concept of visual aiding. That's how we want to think of visual aids. Otherwise, what happens is our audience starts to drone us out. Do you notice the most common complaint we got in the chat? People who read off the slides. What if we challenged ourselves to not even have words on our slides or so many words on our slides that it required reading from a presenter? In fact, reading off slides is so obnoxious to most listeners for the simple reason it eliminates the need for the presenter. You're doing something that I could already do, so why are you even there? And so we're trying to eliminate some of that behavior when we present. So what should we do instead? What are some of the best habits? I love some of these other comments that we got. No pictures, tiny type. I love that one. Using the default text or no images. All of these are common complaints we get around PowerPoint and visual aids. So let's start to address some of them. Here's an image that you see in front of you of Bill Gates, the inventor of PowerPoint, by the way, using PowerPoint. If you take a look, he's introducing a product for the first time to a mass audience. Billions of people around the world will use this product. And as he's introducing Windows Live that day, here's what he's doing. He's giving you his 6 bullet points that makes Windows Live great. And as he's talking, every one of us just did the same thing that everyone in his audience did that day. We just kept reading while he was still talking about the first bullet. Now, what did we do? We stopped paying attention to him and we let the visual aid become the presenter. Now, Bill Gates is notorious for this in that he would just use bullets and he would let all the bullets sit on the screen and the readers and the viewers would just look and study the bullets. That's all that they would do because ultimately that's where the learning is coming from. What if we challenged ourselves to think about this differently? For example, let's take a look at Bill Gates's competitor, how they announced a product. If you notice the screen here, this screen is also announcing a product. It's also displaying something that makes it unique and special and different. But at the same time, Steve Jobs, when he's announcing the iPhone for the first time, did not think bullets were going to help him sell iPhones. It's the same thing with us every time we get up for a presentation. Are the bullets actually going to help? Now, in some cases, if you're teaching, for example, those bullets can be helpful because the students will study them and use them. Sometimes I would challenge you, can you create a separate deck that has those bullets for them to utilize and use a presentation deck as you're presenting? But even then, I certainly understand if you need bullets sometimes. But how many times do those bullets just ultimately do what we could already do with our mouths, with our facial expressions, with our hand gestures, with our eye contact, communicate big ideas and allow the visual to reinforce the idea that I'm communicating? Some of us are old enough to remember a time before PowerPoint. It feels like generations ago. But here's how people used to present. We used to just present ideas. We used to talk them through. We used to allow for some sort of visualization or some sort of tangible item that you could hold or smell or touch in the process. But in the end, we were using visual aids oftentimes as a reinforcement. That's the way we should likely be thinking about visual aids when it comes to even PowerPoint itself. So there's so many things that go with visual aids, some of the ways that you want to think about them. For example, let's take a look at this slide that's in front of you right now. How would you correct this slide? What would you do differently? The truth is most of you are reading it even as I'm talking right now. You're just reading it because whatever this guy is saying makes no sense because I want to know what's on this slide. My visual learning works faster than my audio learning. And so oftentimes we'll just keep reading. So think about it to yourself. What would you do differently for a slide like this? What would you do to make it better? Think about it as possibly a possibility around, do I need everything that's on here? Maybe some of this stuff is not necessary. Here's some things that we'll say right off the bat. Typically speaking, we never want to have multiple fonts on the same slide. There's no benefit there. And ultimately, it's distracting. I'd encourage you to ask yourself the question, why do we have 3 clocks on the side? Is there any connection to what I'm presenting right now? Why is there a ridiculous clip art image at the bottom corner of this slide as well? Sometimes what we do is we fill screens because, again, it's that idea of silence is awkward. So we fill screens. There's space, let's fill it. The way we should be thinking about visual aids is what would allow my audience to get my idea reinforced and quickly come back to learn from me. So what are some of the ways that we can change this? What if we just, instead of using all this words and text, we did something like this? We used one image and one idea, one image and one idea. Now, I think that's still very beneficial. I think that's very helpful because it simplifies and it makes the audience come back to the speaker. But sometimes I would argue we can go even more simple than that. What if we just did this? Think about it as here's an opportunity for me to be the presenter and for the visual aid to be the visual aid. Now, again, I'll stress this. If you're a teacher and you need ideas communicated to your students and they're downloading your slides or they're learning from them, this can sometimes be a little more challenging. But the vast majority of our presentations are presentations where we've used visual aids as our notes, when they should actually be a reinforcement tool for the audience? I love the question from Professor Dowding, who asks, would it have been better if it was a bullet by bullet build? And we're talking, I think, about the Bill Gates slide there. I think that's a fantastic question. Yes, it would be better, but I still ask the question, is it ultimately the best? Would that have been the best way to communicate it? Because here's what he would likely do. He would just regurgitate what that build by build bullet would likely say. He was just repeating it. Is there a way for us to present in a way where our ideas are coming across clearly from us, the speaker, and then reinforced on the screen instead of repeated on the screen, if that makes sense? I love that question. So thank you for asking that. So I'll leave it at this when it comes to visual aids. Now, there are so many other things that we can say when it comes to best practices in public speaking, but I'd love to hear from you. What questions do you have? And you're welcome to throw them in the chat. I'd love to address them there, possibly even address them live. I'm not sure if we have that capability, but definitely throw them in the chat. I'd love to answer them one by one. Maybe you have questions around, how do I prepare? How do I overcome nerves? Or how do I deliver better? How do I get my volume to go up? What can I do differently with organizing my thoughts? How do I get from point A to B? What are the best transitions? Whatever questions you have, feel free to throw them out and we'll try to address them as they come in. And I do understand that we do have live capabilities to answer questions. So if we can utilize that, you're certainly welcome to ask your questions live. And let me stop sharing my screen so we can see each other as we do this as well. Right. All right. How do I find out that correct big idea? That's a fantastic question from Lou. Let me start with that one. The correct big idea is not one that just comes to us. Sometimes we think of it as, I'll just know it when I hear it. The truth is we've got to test it. And so oftentimes what I'll do is if I know I have a big presentation coming up, I'll try to think of the audience. I'll try to think of the big accomplishments. What do I want to accomplish with this audience? I'll try to think of, what does that audience currently know? How do I add to that audience's knowledge? If I need them to be persuaded to do something, how would that audience likely be persuaded? So Lou, I'm often thinking about many different factors, and then I'm practicing different versions of that big idea. Oftentimes I'll write 5 versions of it. I'll think through, so is my big idea that I want to communicate a new way to do something at work? Do I want to communicate a better way to handle blank conflict or problem? I'll start to think through what my big ideas could potentially be. And then I want to figure out, how do I narrow that down to the right big idea? Is I think of the audience and I test it. Sometimes I'll test it with someone who would potentially be in that audience. So I'll do live testing sometimes. Other times I'll think through, what does this organization or does this room need accomplished? And I'll come up with the big idea on my own. But here's something I'd encourage you to do. Try out several and test them wherever possible. I don't think it's a natural thing that we all just figure out. And then as you're testing it, you'll notice you're able to shorten them down. You're able to bring more brevity to those sentences. You're able to sometimes create your presentations with an acronym, 3 P words or 3 C words, or you're able to figure out different ways to sharpen and to make it even more memorable. You'll do that if you keep thinking through that big idea. So I would encourage you, try several, write them out, test them on someone that would likely be in that audience as well. How can we adapt our speech presentation to the audience? I love that question. Thank you for asking that one. I think part of that is constantly being aware of your audience, being knowledgeable on your audience. A couple of weeks ago, I was presenting to a room full of doctors, a room full of physicians. I don't know that world. I'm not personally in that world, but I knew that I had to try to put myself in their shoes and understand what they currently know and where I could add to their knowledge. So if I, a communications professor, went into that room and decided to start talking about medicine, I'm not adding to their knowledge. But what I do know is that they may struggle with some of the communication issues that they're having internally and externally. That's something I can focus on. So I wanted to adapt to the audience in terms of language, in terms of visual aids. Some of the things I know work across the board. Humor works across the board. Visuals and images work regardless of the audience. But I still think personalizing your examples is the best way to adapt to any audience. So if you have a speech that you're giving to a room full of students, Personalize your examples to students. If you're speaking to a group of executives, personalize your examples so that executives would understand them. So I would use an example of an executive. I would use an example of a student. I would use an example that relates to that specific audience. So where do I find the most audience adaptation is typically in examples, my anecdotes, my illustrations, my statistics, my visuals. I adapt those to the audience, and that typically helps with adapting our speech or presentation. Great question from Caleb. How can you present to people who are only looking at computer screens? Is it rude to ask them to close their computers? I do that every day, Caleb, so I hope it's not too rude. Here's what I'll tell you, though. I would say that if your audience is looking at their screens, now I'm guessing this is not Zoom presentations where I'm on Zoom and you're on Zoom. We're talking about in a room, in a live classroom or in a lecture hall, and the presenter is presenting and everyone else is on their screens. Personally speaking, in my classrooms, I do ask my students to close their laptops when someone else is presenting because it is highly distracting and it's very difficult to present. One of the things I would encourage you to do, if you're not allowed to or able to ask people to close their screens, is find the people in the room who are giving you their visual attention, and you don't have to stare at them and look at them. But study them as you're scanning, as your gauge on if this stuff is coming through, if there's good feedback coming back to you. Remember, faces are critical to know if my points are coming across, if people are understanding it. In fact, I've been on this Zoom now for about 45 minutes, and I've been watching Lori's face. Dean Nichols has been on the screen, and I get to see if she's understanding something or not because I don't get to see everyone else's face. So a lot of it is guessing. But I would encourage you, if you don't get to see people's faces, yes, it's possible to ask people to close down their screens and look at you, but know your audience before you do that. If that's not possible, then it's perfectly fine to go ahead and keep presenting. Thank you so much, Anne. Good to see you as well. It's always good to, and Professor Dowding, all of you, it's so good to see you all. One of the things that we always want to do is we want to make sure that we're taking the opportunity to think through, how can I present even if all the worst case scenarios took place? No one is looking at me. Everyone's staring at their screen. No one's really paying attention and giving me live feedback. Could I still present what I'm talking about? And oftentimes that happens just in practice time. If you're comfortable in practice, you'll be comfortable on the day of the presentation as well. All right, Mateo's question is, what are your thoughts on more advanced visual aids? I've seen really engaging slides made on Canva that seem really interesting. Does this enhance the presentation or take away from it? Fantastic question, Mateo. So between Canva and even Prezi back in the day and so many other possibilities with Keynote and PowerPoint even today, there are all kinds of advanced visuals that we can use, right? Where the screen is dynamically moving and operating as the presenter is presenting. I think all of those are wonderful. Here's something that it communicates to the audience, that I took the time and the effort to keep your attention. I think all of that's great. Now, here's the drawback to it. Here's the downside to it. No matter how much we motivate the visual or move the visual, we're still going to have to make that decision. Am I the presenter, or is this where the audience's attention will be? The more the screen moves, the more it forces the eye to go there. So I think there is a challenge there when you have a great Canva presentation, and I've seen so many of them. I think they're so dynamic and they keep the audience interested, and it tells me that my presenter is savvy. That's something that I've always wanted. And so that's something that I think is good. But at the same time, if I know the attention is being drawn away from the person who's presenting, it can be a challenge. So here's what I would encourage you to do. Find the middle ground. Find the middle ground where the Canva presentation doesn't just constantly shift and is not constantly moving, but it settles in the place where you're talking and then moves again when you're ready to transition to the next point. I think that type of work works great. Michael Dowding writes, I don't want to walk around nervously, but I don't want to cling to the podium lectern like a statue. Is a mild ground a possibility? I'm sorry, is a middle ground? You should become a writing professor, Professor Dowding. Is a middle ground a possibility there? Yes, 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 there is. Now, here's my problem here. I often struggle with moving way too much. And then what I do is I overcorrect and I stay behind the lectern or the podium too much, moving or fidgeting around with the technology. I would encourage all of you to find that place where you are comfortable. That's the most important word when it comes to movement, is comfort, because our audiences pick up on artificial behavior. They just pick up on it. We do it all the time as well. When you know someone is nervous, when you know someone is forcefully doing something, you pick up on it. you don't assign more credibility to that person, you assign less credibility to that person. So one of the things we want to do is think about being in that place where we're comfortable. Part of that is pushing us beyond our over comfort, right? So if I'm hiding behind a lectern and only staying there, never using my hands, is to use that persona stuff we were talking about. We take the small calculated risk to take one step at one point in the presentation. And then as we go on, we find that comfort zone. If you find that you're moving because of nerves, then we need to rein it back in, because still that's not comfort then. So if I'm pacing up and down awkwardly and uncomfortably and forcing my audience to study every moment that I'm looking around or moving around, I'm likely nervous. And so what's happening there is the audience is likely picking up on my nerves too. If we can find that middle ground, which I totally believe exists, between staying stationary and moving a little bit around, I think that's a great place to get to. But keep in mind the word comfort. It's got to be comfortable. Anything beyond that looks highly artificial when we do it. Hope that helps to answer some of those questions. Hope I didn't miss any questions as well. I think we got most of them here. Okay. Oh, what gives away that we are nervous during a presentation, and how do we avoid those things? Yeah. Amanda, thanks for that question. I think one of the best ways to answer that question is for you to think through, when have you noticed a speaker that was nervous? What did you notice, right? You probably noticed some of those fight or flight things we talked about. There was probably a lot of uncontrolled movement, which again is because your heartbeat is so much faster and there's a lot of getting ready to run that's happening in your body. So you're probably seeing a lot of unnecessary movement, right? You might see it in the form of shaking papers while you're holding them. You might see hands jittery. You might see face shaking. I've had many students who've had issues where their face kind of twitches, their neck twitches a little bit. And all of that is a physiological response to what's taking place with stress, right? You're reacting to that. But some of the other ways that we don't always clearly see it is when a person is struggling through their words, they're struggling through the content, and we notice that there is a situation of anxiety taking place in that person. That's typically where we'll see some of those nerves. It's going to be in the content. There's a struggle to get from point A to point B. There's this issue between I'm where I am right now and where I need to get to, and there's all this struggle that's taking place. And that causes even more issues. The sweating will start. You'll start that overheating of your body. Your hands get clammy and sweaty. Your throat gets dry. All of those are tells that a person is nervous. I still think a person is most nervous, or it's easiest to tell that a person is nervous when they're clinging to their notes. That's usually the easiest one to tell. When I say clinging, I don't mean notes are bad. Please don't misunderstand me in that regard. They're clinging to their notes. They're studying every word in order to deliver what they have to deliver, which many times they already know. I've seen many students stand up for a presentation and look at their notes to tell the audience, my name is Jane. Now, let's stop and think about this for a second. Why did you need to look at your notes for that? You did it because that crutch was available to you because you were so nervous. So that constant going back to the crutch is one of those things that we think about. And here's what I would challenge you, Amanda. Think about what it might be for you personally. I think for all of us, it's different. Do you notice that when you're nervous that you wring your hands, possibly, that you're doing that? Or are you twitching or moving? Are you constantly moving back and forth? Are you studying and looking at your notes? Find what your own tell is. What is your own struggle with nerves? And then start to attack that in practice. If it's wringing your hands, keep your hands apart and speak with open hand gestures. Watch what happens is over time, your brain becomes hyper aware of it and you're not going to keep wringing your hands. And so we're going to address our own personal tells when it comes to our nerves as well. I know we've only got a few minutes left. I see a question from Professor Borden. Great question. What should presenters do and not do with their hands? I love that, Lisa. Thank you for that question. So here's how we typically think of it, right? So we all do the hand washing. That's a very common thing that we do. When I was being trained as a spokesperson, I had this terrible, terrible habit of cracking my knuckles when I spoke. Terrible habit. So one of the coaches at the time, she was a person who used to train some of the former presidents of the United States, a very, very well-respected public speaking coach. And she used to tell us that whatever you're doing with your hands, start by figuring out where you are. So where I was I was usually presenting in Western cultures. And if I was presenting in a different culture, I'd always have to learn what's appropriate for my hands. I learned that in Western culture, using open hand gestures is a critical way for us to receive an audience. We see honesty and openness through open hand gestures. So wherever possible, keeping your hands open and speaking rhythmically. So what are we doing is we're just accentuating certain words. If we have something that we need to reinforce, I have 3 points for you today. I'm just reinforcing that. It's very delicate, but at the same time, it's open, because Western audiences tend to believe that honesty comes from open hands, it comes from open body language. But at the same time, there were many other cultures that I'd have to work in where I was told right away by my counterpart there, hey, can you tone it down with the open hands, or can you tone it down with all your wide open hand gestures? You look very dishonest when you say that. And so a lot of it is learning our culture, but then also figuring out what to do in those moments. In fact, typically speaking, closed hand gestures, closed fists and pounding of our fists typically communicates a lack of transparency, that we're not being totally honest. And if you want to carry that line directly to the parts of our population that do this the most, lawyers and politicians who do this the most. So you can read into that whatever you'd like. Here's what we're going to typically do for the types of presentations that we give as communicators: teaching, persuasive, informative, these types of presentations. Let's think about open hand gestures. Let's think about keeping our hands used as a rhythmic device that we're using to accentuate, to tell the story, to reinforce. I would encourage any of you who struggle with hand gestures, start by breaking off of the podium or the lectern or whatever you're holding. Break off of that first. Break off of your notes. Get your hands available. Make your hands available first. So that requires practice to get to that place. Once they're available, start to use your hands a little bit. The biggest mistake we can make early is overusing our hands. Your audience picks up on that as well. So start gently. One of the pieces of advice I've used to give was just keep your elbows at around 90 degrees to your body, keep them close to your body, and then just work off of that instead of working with big hand gestures with your arms up. Start small and then work your way from there. Eventually, here's what's going to happen. Your gestures become use of your hands to accentuate and use of your hands to reinforce. I have an idea and I'm going to use it to reinforce. In fact, that coach used to always tell us that one of the former presidents that she used to coach, he would reverse his imagery with his hands. She used to say that, for example, he'd say, we should all work together to lower taxes, is what he used to say. And so he would do it backwards. Now, what was the audience picking up on was the reverse. Wait a second, we're going to raise taxes. What are we doing? So I would just tell you, keep it simple to reinforce the ideas that we have. And the small gestures can become bigger because we're comfortable with the smaller gestures. And that's why I'd say go from there. Thanks for that question, Lisa. Great question. Dean Nichols, I know we're at 4:28 right now. I'm not sure if you'd like me to take more questions, or I'm happy to do that too.
Whatever you prefer, Professor Joseph.
I am
You might have time for one last question, or you can feel free to wrap it up.
Sure. Yeah, if there are no other questions coming in, here's what I'd say as my advice. Sometimes we believe this lie that we tell ourselves, that there are naturally gifted speakers. It's a lie. It's one of those things that we believe. It's a myth that we tell ourselves. She's so good. She's a naturally gifted speaker. None of us are born with a DNA sequence that makes us good, polished presenters, right? It's always something that you've got to learn and practice and get better at. So one of the ways we do this is we go back to that question from the beginning. Why do some presenters present for 2 minutes and it feels like 2 long hours of my life have gone by, and others present for 2 hours and it feels like only 2 minutes have flown by? What happened? They likely engaged you. And how did they engage you? They took on all of their own weaknesses, the situations that they struggled with, they took them on. They practiced against those. They worked at them. It's very intentional. So just like a sport or just like an instrument, public speaking and professional presenting is all about practice and intentionality. You've got to be aware of your weaknesses and go after them one after another. Thank you so much for this opportunity today. I'm so glad that we had this chance to chat. If there's ever anything I can help you with, please don't hesitate to email me. I'm at justinj@bu.edu. You're always welcome to send me a message, and I'd be happy to chat anytime. Thank you all.